Good. Good, you came back. I was watching this section over here because they were.
Don't take any offense to it. The crowd usually thins out after the first break. It's just natural.
They came back. That's good. So where we are is we started out talking sort of on those big, broad level of, in my opinion, the importance of the human dimension or the people side of wildlife conservation. And we embedded that in the father of wildlife management, Aldo Leopold, who talked that the problem of wildlife management is not how we should handle the game, but the real problem is people management, and that wildlife management is comparatively easy, but human management is quite difficult. And so then we talked about sort of those big, broad attitudes and values in terms of how the public relates to natural resource. And then we sort of brought it down to those attitudes toward hunting in terms of what the public thinks and feels and knows about hunting. And we talked about the issues in terms of, well, yeah, people support hunting in general, but there's lots of nuances, as there are in almost every single fish and wildlife issue that we've talked about. So we were sort of leaving that whole idea of the people's values and attitudes, and we're going to start getting into sort of participation issues, because I think those are important as well, and Ed had asked me to talk about those. So I'm going to talk about hunting participation and shooting participation, a little bit about fishing. But I'm also going to talk a lot about outdoor recreation in general. Of course, as the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, you all pretty much focus in on hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, boating. But I'm going to bring it out a little bit more, again, because Ed asked me to, but also because of those public lands that you have gotten a hold of now, that there's sort of sounds like there's some pressure of different groups and constituent groups. And should we be involved with outdoor recreation, or where are we with that? But let's really start out with hunting and shooting and fishing. And I'm going to start out sort of in a lot of ways at the beginning in terms of sport shooting, and talk about the importance, I think, of shooting when it comes to the agency. We do a lot of work for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They're based out of Connecticut, and we have been measuring in the same manner Americans' participation in shooting. And as anybody knows who shoots, it's been an interesting few years. We have gone to stores and tried to get ammo, and the shelves are empty. We may go to our favorite range or our outdoor-indoor range and see more people there, and even different faces of people there. And so let's explore for a couple of minutes. Again, I'm hitting each of these sort of very, very top scale, if you will, but let's talk about sport shooting. Well, we know that there's more Americans shooting now recreationally than probably ever before, at least in the past 50 or 100 years or so. Right now, about 1 out of every 5 Americans is going out at least once in shooting. Now, when you look at that, about almost half of Americans, about 45 to 50%, have firearms in their households. And it seems as though we're getting more people in, but also more of those people who have had a firearm in their house are shooting more and more. And we've seen some increases since 2009. That's due to a lot of different things that I can't get into. But let's talk about some interesting things that are happening among the shooting population out there. About 1 in 5 Americans goes shooting, a lot of them casually, every single year, whether to test their firearm from their house, go do some shooting at the range, go shooting today or tomorrow here in Tennessee. I know you're having a big get-together with kids. Is that true? Okay. And a lot more people are shooting. Now, if you take all of those people who shoot, about 15% of those shooters are new shooters. They hadn't shot a few years ago, but now they are. And what is so interesting is who these people are, because these people probably don't look a lot like maybe us up here. They are more likely to be younger. They're more likely to be female. They're more likely to be in an area of an urban or a suburban area. It's pretty darn cool that there's an infusion of younger, more likely to be female, more likely to be urban and suburban individuals into target shooting. and a lot of the retailers are seeing that. Now, it's interesting that with 15% of the population, of the sports shooting population is new. Only 3 or 4 years ago, it was about 20%. So it seems as though a lot of those people are assimilating in to the shooting participation world. And if you've gone to your own range or the ranges, you've probably seen more younger, more urban, more female individuals out there. The real issue is how are the agencies and how are the profession going to deal with that? Hey, thanks for coming and goodbye, or hey, you don't look like us, so we're really not going to talk to you. But how are we going to assimilate those individuals in to move them on to possibly start hunting? Because a lot of these people aren't hunting, they're shooting, but they're not hunting. And so why is this important? Well, a bunch of the money that you use at the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency comes from the sale of firearms. And so just as it's important for us, for people to hunt, it's just as important for people to shoot for a number of reasons. One is that there's a lot of people doing it, and two, can we move them toward more of the consumptive scale? Now, again, I'm going to throw out little things, but I think shooting is very important for a lot of reasons, from a financial reason, from a perspective of possibly moving those people into hunting. From a shooting perspective, though, shooting ranges are very important. And this is a study that we did a few years ago for the National Shooting Sports Foundation that showed a kind of an interesting thing. You never know what you're going to find when you do research, but what we named this is that 15 minutes is all it takes to lose a shooter. We know that there's a lot of money coming in. This past year, Fish and Wildlife Service distributed about $1.1 billion to the agencies across there, mostly due to a lot more people buying a lot more firearms and ammo. But people will drop out of shooting based on the location of the nearest shooting range. Take a look at this. This is a pretty cool graph. I know you guys don't love graphs. I love graphs. This is sort of a Michelangelo graph, if you will. Active shooters live less than 30 minutes away from a range. Ex-shooters live almost 45 minutes from a range. Now, in any type of research like this, you don't know what cause and effect is, but this is pretty darn interesting that there's a clear, direct relationship and statistically significant relationship between how far somebody lives to a range and how active they are shooting. 15 minutes is all it takes to lose a shooter. So as you start to look at the future and what it is that you do, understand that the location of those shooting ranges and access to those shooting ranges is pretty darn important. Why is shooting important to wildlife conservation? As we all know, and as I've alluded to, that federal aid in wildlife restoration comes from hunters, but it also comes from a lot of shooters who don't hunt. Take a look at this graph here. This is an amazing graph. This is brand new information. In fact, you guys may be one of the first to see this. This is the pie of all hunters and shooters out there in the U.S. 44% of those target shoot but don't hunt. So probably half of the money that the agencies, the Fish and Wildlife agencies are receiving out there are coming from people who don't hunt, at least from the federal aid and wildlife restoration side, not from the sport fish restoration side. 41% hunt and shoot, and only 14% hunt but don't target shoot. Those are the people you want to really stay out of the woods near, right? They're not practicing. I don't know. I don't be in the woods with them. But that's a pretty amazing graph. I think that's a pretty powerful graph. So let's move from shooting to hunting. As we all know, hunting across the U.S. has been declining for the past 20 years. This is not laziness on my part because this is federal aid money. They just haven't released those numbers yet. If you go online, they'll show that it's like 2014, but actually 2014 numbers are 2012 numbers, 2013 or 2011 numbers. They're always running 2 years behind. So, but I want to show you sort of as a big picture, not a pretty scene in terms of participation in hunting. I know that your hunting licenses have held steady for about the past 5 years or so, but a lot of your sister agencies, a lot of your sister fish and wildlife agencies across the U.S. are experiencing some declines. This is from the what's called the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. They only do that every 5 years. This is 2006 to 2011 that shows Tennessee with a 4% increase. A lot of the states did experience increases between 06 and 11. In terms of what the U.S. looks like for hunting participation, this is a study I did last year for the Fish and Wildlife Service, where we asked states, what their participation was between 2012 and 2014 to bring that national survey data up to date. You can see that a lot of the states in the southeast were reporting an increase, but that's kind of about where it was. The green, this is just simply green, red, and yellow. Green is increasing, yellow is staying the same, red is decreasing. These colors here are hybrids where they couldn't quite decide in Iowa and other places. And in terms of hunting participation, projected, what the state said, well, this is not license sales. This is just, do you think between 14 and 16, is your hunting participation, you're going to stay increase, decrease, or stay the same? You can see kind of across the board, a lot of people think it's going to stay the same. Some states, Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, Maine, Washington State, Idaho, think that maybe there might be a slight increase. So kind of a mixed bag in terms of hunting participation across the U.S., but certainly along a backdrop of declining participation. Archery participation, we do a lot of the market research for the Archery Trade Association. I think this is important too, because the money that you receive comes from archery. When people buy some of that various equipment, they are taxed, and that money is given to you. This is kind of a cool timeline that I did because we saw this increase in archery participation in 2012. And our studies show that for the Archery Trade Association of a large number of people getting involved in archery participation in 2012. It's certainly no secret why that happened. Archery participation is sort of holding steady. Again, the question from me to you is, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to just let those people go by? A young girl comes in and wants to do archery because Katniss did that. Do you guys know who Katniss is? I bet you guys know who Katniss is. One of the lead figures in that. That's pretty cool. Are we going to say, hey, this is great, come join the ranks of outdoors persons? Or are we going to be, well, she's not really old, white, and rural, so she's really not our constituent? Well, I think that would be a really bad decision. There's a lot of people out there now who are shooting, who are potential constituents of the agency, who are doing archery as potential constituents of the agency. And I think that's pretty darn exciting. In terms of archery participation, again, there's a bunch of people out there who are doing archery but aren't hunting. And when those people buy that equipment, they're still paying federal aid taxes. So are they a constituent of ours, and what are we doing about that? I could bore you for days on hunting participation. That's what we've done a lot of. I've written a book and several dozen reports on hunting. I'm going to give you sort of top-level stuff on hunting participation, because I think these are important. We know that there's several factors involved that impact hunting negatively. And here they are. Whatever you hear, this is what they are. This is the big five. These are those big things that are impacting hunting. We know there's direct relationships between urbanization, an aging society, fewer whites within the population, less access, and less opportunity. This is why hunting is declining on what I call a macro scale. On a micro scale, let's take a look at your hunters and hunters nationwide and see what those dissatisfactions are. And I'm going to point these and show you two different ways. I'm going to show you what the dissatisfactions are among active hunters, and then I'm going to talk about the dissatisfaction among those who are sort of ex-hunters. So let's take a look about the dissatisfaction among active hunters. What are they? Are they expensive licenses? Are they anti-hunters? Are they too many hunters in the field? Nope. They are access issues. Access is your number one issue that active hunters are relaying to us over and over and over again that are important to them. The more access that we can provide to hunters, the better. Now, this is slide one. Look at these things down here, things that aren't issues. Bag limits, not enough trophy game. Certainly those are important to us. Certainly those are important to people who come to the commission meetings and stuff, but they don't rank anywhere near those access issues. How about dissatisfaction among inactive hunters or ex-hunters, if you will? This is a study that we did a couple of years ago for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we located ex-hunters nationwide, and we said, is this a reason that caused you not to hunt anymore? Is this a reason? Is this a reason? So they answered yes or no, actually in a more of a Likert type scale, but a yes or no fashion of yes, this was an issue, or no, this wasn't. And I want you to look at those top reasons that are driving hunters out. Amount of free time, family obligations, work obligation, loss interest. Man, those things drive Fish and Wildlife Agency people crazy. Don't you wish it was the cost of a license? You do something about it. Don't you wish it was, I don't know, cost of hunting equipment? Because we could probably do some things about that. How do you deal with amount of free time? These are those sort of what we scientists call squishy issues, right? How do you deal with those? How do you deal with those? And I'll recall Leopold again. Leopold has a strong influence on a lot of biologists. I am a biologist by training a long time ago. But Leopold said that recreational development is a job not of building roads into lovely country, but of building receptivity into the still unlovely human mind. So sometimes when we talk about bringing hunters back, we're going to lower license costs, or we're going to get more game out there. Well, you know what? Sometimes those social aspects, family, mentoring, all of those people, the social science aspects, are actually more important than some of those resource-related things. I'm not saying resource-related issues aren't important. You can't fish without fish. You can't hunt without deer. But there's a lot more to it than just sort of getting that game or the cost of a license. We know there's major differences when you start looking at those who hunt now and those who no longer hunt. The one thing that we know is there's a lot more hunters out there than hunt every year. The Fish and Wildlife Service tells us that 6 or 7% of the American public hunts each year. But we know that about 17 or 18% of the American public actually either considers themselves a hunter or has gone hunting once in the past 4 or 5 years. And when you guys see your hunting license sales kind of doing this, don't think that those are the same people. There are people coming in, there are people dropping out, there are coming in. That is a net average of your license sales. But there are people coming in. This guy hunts one every 3 years. That happens to be his year. People move out. And it's what we call churn. And a lot of it is happening. But it's very deceiving because you see your licenses doing this and you think, oh, those must be the same people. But the truth is that there's a lot of churn out there. And so this is just sort of the composition of people who hunt now, have hunted in the past, or hunted a long time ago. And I thought this was an important one to show you because what we did is we did this really cool cross-tabulation. We said, what are the differences between active and inactive hunters? And there were some really important factors. People who actively hunt, out of about 200 characteristics that we cross-tabulated, a hunter is more likely to hunt if they have a family member who hunts. You've heard about the social aspects or the social dimension of hunting. Some people call it the social habitat of hunting. It's the number one issue in terms of that reasons that keep people in. These people are younger. They were more likely to be initiated by their father, and they were more likely to be initiated at a younger age. How about those inactive hunters? Well, the inactive hunters look almost the opposite. They didn't have social support, and they're dropping out. They're older, and they drop out. They weren't initiated by a father or father-like figure. Don't confuse us, though, with that whole single-parent household issue, because there's research that shows that that's not true. But that's for another day. They're more likely to be urban, and they're more likely to have been initiated at an older age. People who continue to hunt and don't drop out look really different than people who hunt versus people who have dropped out. So we know that hunters come from hunting families, and hunting families produce hunters. And I wrote one time, it takes a hunter to make a hunter. It takes a hunter to make a hunter. And when you talk about your hunting initiation programs, that's really important. When you look at all of the kids out there who hunt between the ages of 8 and 18, 92% of them come from a hunting household. And so when we talk about hunting, the hunting heritage and hunting culture and hunting families is incredibly important. And initiating kids at a younger age is really important. This is another just amazing graph that shows essentially kids who, or people who are initiated into hunting at a younger age are more likely to be hunters. Let's talk, that's 5 minutes worth of 25 years worth of research, so sorry. But we'll move on. Or we could stay until 6. Got anything? No, okay. It's looking pretty good. Let's talk about fishing participation just for a few minutes. Fishing participation in general has dropped over the past couple of decades. It's bounced around a little bit. There's some reasons for fishing desertion, and those are social issues as well. People losing interest, amount of free time, family obligation, no one to go with, work obligations. Those drive people nuts because it's harder to do and orient yourself and develop programs to those things as opposed to these things like not enough trophy fish, creel limits, finding a place to buy a license. So many times we focus in on those issues there at the bottom and forget about some of these issues at the top, the real issues. So I heard a story one time that a guy was walking down the street and he sees a guy looking under a street lamp for something, and he comes over and he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm looking for my keys." He said, "Oh, what happened?" He goes, "I lost them about 20 minutes ago and I can't find them." And so he's looking, the guy says, "Well, can I help you look?" And he says, "Sure." It's dark out, but the street light is throwing some light onto the grassy area where he was. So they looked, and literally this guy looked in every single inch in that area. And he stood up, he goes, "I don't think your keys are here. I mean, I don't think your keys are here. We've looked everywhere." He goes, "Where did you lose them?" And he said, "Well, I lost them over there." He said, "Well, why are we looking over here?" And he said, "Well, the light's better. The light's better." And so it's sort of a funny way to say, well, you know, what are we doing? When we start arguing about creel length or this or that, are we really dealing with those bigger, larger issues? You're not allowed to ask a question. What?
Mark, have you looked at interdependence between the thing like loss of interest and the quality, which would be related to how many fish are there, or the quality of fish that are there? Is there any interdependence between the things that are on either end of that spectrum?
There are. Again, that's a conversation. That's a long conversation that we can have afterwards. So, and I'm not trying to skirt it. Just there's a lot more to it. But the major point here is that let's not be that person looking where the light is better if it really doesn't solve the problem. We know things are changing in the hunting field in terms of why people hunt, and we know why people are fishing is changing too. 20, 30, 40 years ago, hunters and anglers, and I haven't shown you the hunting stuff just because of time, but anglers, in this case, are fishing for quite different reasons. Take a look at some of these changes between 80 and 2010. Fishing to be with friends and family. Look at those social reasons, how they have increased, versus catching fresh fish for food has decreased, where catching large fish has decreased. Only about 2% of the hunting population, 1 to 2% of the hunting population is hunting for the primary reason of getting a trophy. And that's about the same for fishermen. That's pretty darn interesting when sometimes we focus a lot of our attention on those 1 or 2% of our anglers or our hunters out there. So what are the real reasons people are out there pursuing what it is that we manage? So again, that's 2 or 3 minutes for decades worth of work. So I'm kind of not being very fair to you, but we'll also get you out here by 3:30 this afternoon or so. So how about, and I'm only kidding, but let's talk about participation in outdoor activities, because this was an area that Ed had asked me to address. I normally wouldn't do that with agencies, but again, because of the lands that you're acquiring and how you're acquiring them, I know there's been some issues and debate about how those are used. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about outdoor recreation apart from hunting and fishing and archery and such. We know that a lot of people participate in Outdoor recreation, a whole lot of different things. These are studies, just various studies that I pulled together that I've done. These are something called the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan studies, where we do general population studies and how much people participate in things. And there's couch potatoes out there, but there's a lot more people who are doing various things. What are they doing? This is work from the National Survey of Recreation and the Environment that's primarily funded by the U.S. Forest Service, where they looked at 50 nature-based activities, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. There was a general increase in the past decade that they did this study in nature-based activities, as well as the number of days. And my own research on an individual scale is showing that same thing, that over the past 10 years or so, that there has been more of a turn toward nature-based activities than things like other outdoor recreation activities like flag football or basketball or other things, that Americans seem to be moving again toward nature-based activities. Now, the thing is that any kind of study is based on the context in which it was. We just came out of a horrific recession. And so I don't know if that's due to because of recessionary factors or if it's a big, broad trend. I can't tell you that. I want to warn you about some of these studies that say that there's nature-based orientation and increases, but I can't tell you that that's going to be true in the future. In fact, somebody once said when Ed talked to me about talking about the future and trends, it reminded me of a quote that I once heard, that forecasting is hard, particularly of the future. You know, I don't know, but we know what are trends. So these guys looked at 50 outdoor activities. I didn't put any names on them, but I want to show you the top 10 and the bottom 10 activities. At the top were things like viewing nature or visiting outdoor nature centers or sightseeing. Very, very what we call non-consumptive, very general types of things, visiting beaches, viewing fish and wildlife, and those types of things. On the other spectrum were sort of these more what I would call hardcore types of activities like windsurfing and scuba diving, surfing, things that very few people are doing. A lot of people are doing it intensively and such, but when you look at the number of people who are surfing, or you don't have to worry about ice fishing here, but orienting or something, know that there's this huge sort of divergence in the percentage of people who are doing it. And also keep in mind when people talk to you about percentage increases. I mean, you can go from 1 person to 2 person doing an outdoor activity, and it's going to show up as a 100% increase, but it's still 2 people. So always keep in context large percentages of people who are doing something versus the percentage change. And so what I did is I tried to sort of give you and develop this over the past couple weeks of what are some of the characteristics of those fastest growing activities. They're related to viewing and photographing nature, and we saw that both in terms of number of participants and the number of days that they're doing it is increasing. Those physically challenging activities like kayaking and snowboarding, surfing you don't really have to worry about, but kayaking, canoeing, and those types of things are showing major percentage growth increases as well. And there's some reasons for that. One of those is that 20 years ago, it was pretty expensive to buy a canoe or kayak. And now you can go to Dick's or Bass Pro Shops. You can pick one up for pretty darn cheap. And so there's a lot more people out on the water. And technology is changing that, from bicycles and the affordability of it. And that's sort of the main driving force beyond that, as well as people's interest in getting into nature as well. Well, how about some of those declines in participation? Again, when I looked at them, some of these, I put them here because that's what it was. It's not going to affect you, but some of those traditional winter activities like snowboarding, except for snowboarding, things like skiing was showing a decline. Those, again, snowboarding being the exception of sort of that harder, hardcore type of activity. And so let me show you these, the rapidly changing preferences. Kayaking is sort of going through the roof. Snowboarding is increasing. Snowmobiling is kind of staying steady. Cross-country skiing is going down. So I want to talk about kayaking. And this, I'm going to interject a little bit of my own personal thing here because I think it's important. We do a lot of work. Actually, I met Ed when he was the boating coordinator, right, from here a while ago and stuff. But I think this is really interesting when I talk to agencies about this. As Ed said, I own a house. I live in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, which is beautiful. I'm glad he didn't mention some of the things. Are there any Vanderbilt fans here? None? Zero? Zero. Okay, well, I'm safe. So, okay. So he didn't mention that both my kids are at the University of Virginia. So he left out my Ivy League education too. I figured if he told people that I went to Yale that it would be like, oh, he's weird. Or, I mean, I'm already weird, but, you know. So I'm glad you mentioned the University of Tennessee roots. So I own a beach house in Chincoteague, Virginia. And I go hunting. And when I do that, I buy a hunting license. And when I buy ammo, I buy ammo. And that money goes to the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. And I have a boat. And when I buy fuel, that money goes to the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries because it's taxed under sport fish and sport fish restoration. And I love to shoot. When I talked about the new Beretta and the new Benelli, that was me. I bought a new Beretta and Benelli the past couple years. And that's taxed at 11%. Wow, so I'm contributing when I shoot and when I hunt and when I boat. I also love to fish. I'm not a very good fisherman, but I know people who are, so I go with those people. And when I buy a fishing pole, it's taxed. And when I buy gas to go fishing, it's taxed. And when I buy lures, it's taxed. That's pretty fun, isn't it? I'm not telling you about my personal life for a reason. I own a kayak. You know how much money that I give the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries for a kayak? Just saying without the G. Okay, so let's talk about demographic and recreation trends, because I think these are important to you in terms of looking at your future. We know that non-Hispanic whites dominate participation. Who are more likely to participate in outdoor activities? Males, young to middle-aged people, college-educated, and higher-income people. And we know that different people participate in various activities. But we know throughout the population that we serve some people really well, and we don't serve other people well at all. Who are those people? Those people are more likely to be African Americans. Those people are more likely to be older, less educated, lower income, and people with disabilities. And the research shows us. The research clearly shows who we are serving and who we're not. And as we look into the future, those are important. And this is going to be important when we start talking in a few minutes about demographic trends. So again, a lot of work and a lot of research has been involved with outdoor recreation. I'm giving you a few minutes worth. But the projections are those challenge activities, equestrian activities, motorized water activities, and day hiking, along with nature-based activities, are projected to increase, while decreasing are things like motorized off-road activities, motorized snow activities, and floating activities, which I think is interesting on the floating part. So keep that in mind. So we've talked about attitudes and values. We've talked about outdoor recreation. And I'm moving into this last section that Ed asked me to talk about on demographic trends. Because we know that demographics can be very important when it comes to influencing people's outdoor recreational choices. We don't know why yet as social scientists, but we know they affect them. We know that in largely rural states, more people hunt, and in more urban states, they don't hunt. It's a direct correlation. And so as we start looking to the future, what is it going to look like? What is America? What is the Southeast? What is Tennessee going to look like in the next 5 years or 10 years or even 50 years? Because they have some profound influences not only on outdoor recreation, but also on attitudes and values. And as we move in there, I think it's important to know about. And so when you look at demographers, when you talk to people at the Bureau of the Census, really anybody from a university perspective, they're going to say that when it comes to demographic trends, the Southeast, America and the Southeast, are looking at 5 major demographic trends that are sort of the most important. Increasing population, just sheer numbers, there's more people. An increase in urban residents, an increase in older residents, an increase in minority residents, and an increase in immigrant populations. These are the big things that are affecting America as a whole and will ultimately affect all of the fish and wildlife agencies across the nation. So let's just take sort of a snap, just a bird's eye view in terms of what's happening. Well, the first thing is there's just a lot more people. There are a lot more people. And how does that affect outdoor recreation? Well, there's going to be a lot more people out doing things and utilizing the resources that we are providing and that we manage for. I mean, by 2045, from 2000 to 2045, there's a 42% increase in the American population. That is staggering. That is staggering. But again, they're all not going to look like us. Look at this. This is basic light. I need to do that, make this in darker. This is the percent of Americans that live in urban versus rural areas. It's sort of historical, but look at that. Look at the incredible, again, you don't really need to make a graph for this, but it's pretty amazing. The rise of increase in urban residents and the decrease in rural residents. And that absolutely directly affects what it is that we do. Because largely, and I would imagine your state legislators changing legislators across the U.S., is that in the past, a lot of those people have been from more rural environments and understand what it is that we do, from hunting, fishing, boating, and viewing activities. And more I'm hearing from the agencies that that's not as true as it used to be. How do we deal with that? And what are the impacts? We know it's happening. Are we dealing with that, and are we thinking about that? We know that people are getting older in our population, the graying of America, if you will. There's just simply going to be more senior citizens in the future than there were in the past. This is a little bit of a projection out, but I wanted to include it because it just blew my mind. In 2056, which you might say, oh man, that seems like forever ago, but if you look back, it's sort of equal to like the 1970s. I remember the 1970s. There are going to be more people over 65 than under 18. Now, that's certainly way in the future, but it's not as far in the future as we think, and we're moving in that direction. What are we doing as fish and wildlife agencies to better understand and work with senior citizens? We know that for hunting and fishing, as a population ages, people are unfortunately less likely to hunt and fish. How about race and issues related to population changes in the U.S.? Some incredible changes, and just take a look at this, and to graph them out for you. With white alone, this is the percent of the total population decrease. African American, blacks, a slight increase across the U.S. Asians, slight increase. Look at this drop in non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic of any race. I mean, literally doubling. Oh, well, Hispanic race. Well, does that affect us? Well, yeah, it does. Look at Tennessee there. Between 2000 and 2012, the 5 states with the fastest growing Hispanic populations were your state. And so what does that do in terms of participation levels, in terms of constituents of ours? What are we doing about that? Now, a lot of the sister agencies are. You might have heard of the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation. A part of federal aid and sport fish restoration funds, about $12, $13 million a year, is given to that organization to help increase fishing participation across the U.S. And they're doing a really good job in terms of developing fishing materials for Hispanics, targeted at Hispanics. And again, I could talk a lot about this, but I'm sort of covering topic areas. But I want to relay a story that I have because I think it sort of encapsulates this. This was probably 20 years ago or so. I was hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to better understand why African Americans don't fish at the same rates that whites do. And we did a lot of the demographic analysis, and we did this and we did that. We did a series of focus groups, discussion groups across the U.S. And one of the groups, they're supposed to last 2 hours, I think lasted about 4 hours. And it was really incredible because at the end, one African-American woman said to me, well, you know what, Mark, it comes down to this. You buy things that look like you. You buy things that look like you. And she started talking about some greeting card company, I don't remember that was oriented toward African-Americans. I don't remember that part of it. What has stuck with me for over 20 years is you buy things that look like you. And she said, well, I watch Saturday morning fishing shows or those hunting shows. I've never seen an African-American on that. And Lord, have I never not seen an African-American woman on those fishing shows. And about a year later, I was asked to do about the same project with kids. Why aren't kids orienting and initiating themselves into fishing like they used to? And kids were there, and Mr. Duda. And they said, you know, I'd like to fish, but, and they really didn't talk like that. That's right. but it was for dramatic purposes.